Thanks for taking some time to talk about the multi-bass, a little bit of your history, kind of backstory of the multi-bass, how it came sort of to be, your inspiration for it, our collaboration and development, and then some sort of wrap up, Morris Palter personal reflections,
Yeah, right.
things like that. Can you just give us a little bit of your history, like how you got started playing percussionist, what your background is?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. This is really great. Happy to be here talking to you guys at Black Swamp. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Toronto, Canada. I don't think my story is all that unique in terms of what I think a lot of percussionists started as, a drum kit player, played kit as a little kid, of course, growing up in the shadows. I mean, literally growing up where the song Subdivisions by Rush was literally about,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
obviously, got playing a lot of drum set, and then, in high school playing in, the concert bands and all the rest of it. And then from there, just sort of, decided I wanted to do music and a music degree. I was lucky that my parents were supportive of that. And so I ended up at the University of Toronto, my undergrad, with the Nexus guys at that time. This is like in the very late, like 1989, 1990.
Yeah.
And just sort of went from there. And just, from there I went to Europe, the Hay Conservatory, on to UC San Diego with Steve. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just sort of that natural progression. Like you just sort of start with a practice pad and sticks. And I think I probably had a lot of
Right.
excess energy as a kid, and drums made sense. I did start on piano and really didn't like it very much. And so moved to
Yeah.
drums.
Any other musical inspirations or
Well, I mean, outside of
as you
that,
go?
it became the orchestral player. I mean, it was certainly Nexus was a huge influence, and when I ended up at the University of Toronto, I was lucky that it was still the era where John Cage was alive, and he would be there
Mhm.
often. Steve Reich came a lot because both Russ and Bob. Russ was my principal teacher, Russell Hartenberger, and they were both playing in Steve Reich ensemble. So Steve Reich was there a lot. And so I got those sort of early influences of that music mixed in with all this other stuff. So that was, I mean, I got a pretty healthy education in that kind of, like, the stuff that Nexus was famous for performing was the stuff that they also really embedded in their students, like those pieces. So I
Yeah.
wasn't really studying Xenakis and Stockhausen and more of that kind of contemporary music. I was studying more of, like, that the Cage, the West Coast, the California, Blue Harrison, John Cage,
Sure.
and then the minimalist stuff. And so that all became sort of a big part of my early education or exposure to things.
Yeah.
And then meeting those people, right? Like meeting John Cage and meeting Steve Reich, like that was also really putting a context into the thing you're playing.
So what were the circumstances in meeting John Cage?
Russell Hartenberger taught lessons, like the students, but Robin Engelman from Nexus taught percussion ensemble. And so he was really, pro Cagean type of vibe to his whole musical aesthetic. And so I'm sure we were doing this, retrospective John Cage concert, and John Cage, of course, is coming to it. And I remember we did Credo and Us, which is, the two percussionists and the person on the radio and then a pianist. And I played on it.
Yeah.
And John Cage played the radio part, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
and
Perfect.
I'm ashamed to admit it, but like, and I don't know if this is just a circumstance of just where you are in life at that time, but it didn't strike me as like, this is a really amazing moment that you need to cherish. Like, he is right here sitting with you. It's just like, oh, it's the composer and it's cool. He's here. It's kind of this old guy and he wrote this piece, and, we worked with other composers before. Like, it didn't, I'm sad to say, I wish I could say it was more like prescient in that moment. But I was like, an 18-year-old, dirtbag kid that loved Rush with long hair. And I was like, okay, I'm playing this piece. But he was wonderful. He was really cool, and I wouldn't say I had my chops fully developed yet, so he was very patient with all of us.
Before we move on, it's just worth noting for watchers and listeners right now that you have a very eclectic background. I mean, drum set, xylophone, rag type stuff, which is obviously from Bob Becker, and then modern percussion. So you kind of have this fusion of interests and styles that makes you exceptionally unique.
Well, I appreciate that. I would just add to that, it's something that I try to instill in students that come and study with me is that you kind of have to find a couple of unique, not necessarily unique, but diverse areas to really dive into, especially, and again, this is just my personal opinion in percussion, because it's such, as we know, percussion is not an instrument, right? It's like a world, it's a family. So you have to kind of find areas that you get really, in my opinion, like expert level at. And I think that's how careers, frankly, are made, rather than like trying to do a bunch of everything. And I know lots of people are good at that. But for me, it was always like drum set, hardcore contemporary music, and ragtime xylophone, like those are the three areas that I sort of dove deep into.
Okay, so the multi-bass. Can you tell us what the multi-bass is?
And its heart and soul, it's a drum, right? Like it is a drum, but I think it's a uniquely placed drum in sort of the hierarchy of drums. And so when we talk about a set of tom-toms, or a gradation set of tom-toms starting, from 6, 8, 10, 12, all the way down, it sort of ends at 16-inch for the most part. Like floor tom sizes, 18-inch toms are kind of rare. They're difficult to mount, like they don't really exist in the world. And then at the other end of it, you've got concert bass drums, which tend to be really big. So to me, it's the sort of drum that sort of bridges the gap between those sizes in a way that it sort of fits perfectly in the middle of that sort of hierarchy of drums. And it's come in unbelievably useful in my career, and I think in a lot of people's career now.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear kind of your perspective on what the purpose of the multi-bass is. But I was just going to ask basically what the inspiration or the impetus for the multi-bass was.
It was really just from playing the types of pieces that needed big drums in them, and really the only option was, a concert bass drum at the time. And most times, a concert bass drum on a stand, you'd tilt it, it would be on an angle. When you laid it flat, it was way up high. It could be up here at your chest when you're standing up. And so it's not really useful to play it like that. And then again, you'd have pieces where you would go from like 16-inch drum to like a 32-inch bass drum. It's just like it's just too wide of a gap between those sizes. And then of course the pitches, and then the versatility of the setup itself, trying to fit a drum that big. And so, it was really obviously from like real world experience. I mean, it was born out of necessity, really, and just being tired of like, okay, now I got to take this concert bass drum off the stand. I got to lay it flat on two chairs so I can get it lower, and it's still a giant drum. And it was inherently problematic when I wanted to play. I probably started with pieces like Rebo and Safa, those types of multi pieces, even some of the chamber works of Xenakis, where it just became cumbersome and problematic. But I mean, no shortage of pieces, multi-pieces or multi-setups that utilize drums. And it just became like this, I'm not sure it was necessarily a light bulb moment, but it sort of feels like that. Just thinking like, I just want a miniature concert bass drum that I can put at any height. Like that's what I need. I need it. I'm tired of not having that. And I think that was again and again and again, not having that and not having that and not having that and getting frustrated.
Sure.
It just made it seem like there's got to be a world where this instrument can fit and exist and be available to people. Right. I mean, you can take a kick drum on its side. Yes, okay. So fine. Kick drum sizes are roughly the same size, but kick drums tend to be really deep. They got legs, like legs pointing the wrong way. They've got mounts and hardware on them. They tend to weigh a ton. And again, you still got to put it on two chairs right at that time. Like it still wasn't any way to put it somewhere where it's helpful. Maybe the size, and usually the heads on kick drums aren't really the right heads that you want. I mean, there's a whole host of problems with going down that road as well.
Can you just comment on the sound specifically? Like, was there something you were kind of striving for sonically?
For sure. I mean, one of the other big issues that you would find with most concert bass drums is that they ring like hell forever, and then you're having to manage that. I mean, that's one of the things we love about them, that we can manage, like in an orchestral setting, that we can adjust the level of dampening as we play and as the piece dictates. But in a multi-percussion setup where I'm trying to match things a little bit more even, it became like an endless struggle of like towels and foam and all those things, of which you had to tape on the drum so it doesn't fly away when you hit it and move around. And So I definitely wanted like a warm sound. I wanted a sound that still had some resonance to it, but not like a concert bass drum would and does have in the context. Because if you're playing a bunch of tom-toms, then you hit a concert bass drum, it's a radically different sound as we go down the line. And then you end there. It's like, it's sort of sticking out like a sore thumb, you know, for lack of a better expression. Right. And so I definitely wanted a more homogeneous sound to the setup.
So let's talk a little bit how the collaboration began with Black Swamp.
Sure. I mean, Black Swamp was kind of the perfect company to manage this because, first of all, we had a close relationship, personal friend relationship. I'd already been with the company for a number of years. But you go to PASIC and like the owner, operators, like CEOs, like they're there. They're right there at the booth, right? So you're not like talking to a rep that then has to talk to this and talk to that and a whole hierarchy, chain of command to get anything done. You're literally talking to the people that make the decisions. And so that was, I think, unique to the Black Swamp experience for me. And it's always been unique to my relationship with you guys. It was PASIC 2010 that I just came to the booth and said that I had this idea, and I think it's a good idea, and I think it's a drum that is worth exploring. I don't think there's anything like it in the market, and here's why, for all the things we've talked about before, why it's important to set up. And you know, looking back on it now, that same year, 2010, I was the host of Focus Day at PASIC. And so I was overseeing like all those Focus Day concerts. And it was that same thing as trying to manage all these concert bass drums for like all of these setups. It's just like, this is impossible to deal with. It just sort of all came together in that moment. But that was it. I mean, it was just like all those things we talked about. Like it just needed something like that. And I think the most important aspect was just the versatility and the usability of something that does not take forever to manage. Like, okay, I need a big drum. It's like, here we go again, taking some off the stand, putting on some chairs, putting on tail. Maybe if you're lucky, you can put it on the back of the chairs, but it's on the steep angle. I mean, it's all those types of things. You, Eric, everyone was just like, yeah, like this sounds like a good idea. Like there was no point that I felt there was any kind of pushback or any, I mean, there was questions, of course, but there wasn't any like, oh no, man, like this is impossible. Like you don't understand how impossible this is going to be for us to do. Like there's no talk like that, which I'm really grateful for. Which again, I think was why Black Swamp was the perfect company to start this revolution.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate that, and I think there was a few stars that aligned, at least on our end. I mean, obviously we build drums, so we have access to shells. You know, Eric had designed a lug that would work. There's a hoop lug that matches the lugs. So it was like, oh, yes, all of this makes sense. You know, we have access to the materials. We already have some hardware. We have an artist that's like on fire to do this and to help see it through, which is also very important. Not just an idea, but be able to collaborate on it and make decisions. And so it all kind of started to come together. So I'm glad to hear it was relatively friction-free. I guess the process.
It truly was. And I also remember in those first conversations about like, I think very early on, we decided on like a telescoping leg for it and thinking about camera tripods and how those legs work and the lightweight and versatility of it and how we wanted it, the entirety of the drum to still be able to be moved easily so that the legs were attached to it, could fold in kind of flush against the shell. So you're not dealing with stuff sticking out everywhere like how legs on a kick drum would be, or there's no, you know what I mean? So, the usability axis of it to me was equally important. I mean, obviously you want it to sound great and all the rest of it. And so I remember early on, it was like telescoping legs on this thing, it's just like, I just remember like all these light bulbs kind of like happening between people as we talked about this.
I mean, I think the legs are like really the game changer for the instrument because yes, we could have built, like Stravinsky drums or like, kind of shorter depth type stuff, or we could have just made a bass drum that could sit on some chairs. At the time, I think Eric was playing with the Grand Rapids Symphony regularly. He had situations where he needed to mount bass drums and didn't want to use chairs, so he was kind of developing more of a stand that could be sort of angle adjusted somehow. So, but it was pretty crude, but it got the job done because you were talking about, necessity is sort of the mother of invention sometimes. Like that's the case with several of our products. Eric was already trying to think through like how to solve his problems and then having conversations with you about, oh yeah, this telescoping legs is brilliant. You know, how are we going to attach it to the shell? I definitely think that was sort of a vision or direction for the drum. Were there any challenges kind of integrating your musical or technical visions in seeing through the project that stick out to you a little bit?
Right. I mean, I wish I could say you guys caused me all these problems along the way to make it more dramatic, but
Right.
you know, the one important thing that, again, we were on board with is the depth of hoops on concert bass drums tend to be 4 or 5 inches. And of course, where the head lays in relation to those hoops is pretty low below the top edge of that thing. And so a lot of concert bass drums also have like T-rod tension things. And so the number of times that I would hit the rim instead of the drum, or hit my hand even worse than anything else. I remember talking about wanting to have really as low depth hoop as possible so we can mitigate that issue. And I think that might have been one of the bigger challenges. And then you can maybe speak to that more than I can. But I think it had to have a width to it that worked with the lug drilled into it, with still being able to create the tension that you need to hold the head down. I can see that too narrow or too few plies would potentially crack or not do the job.
I mean, we call it reducing stick interference. Like the low profile hoop is intended to, well, exactly what you were talking about, reduce stick interference. And I do remember, Eric kind of thinking through that and going, oh, well, we can only make a hoop so short. The attachment screws have to fit on. The hoop lug has to fit. There has to be enough stability in order to, you're right, properly tension the head and to hold everything together. So it came together and it worked. So I kind of remember that.
I think when you have a bunch of drummers trying to sort out these issues for drummers, I think it actually is helpful, right? Like that's another big part of why it worked well with Black Swan.
Yeah, we're all musicians, mostly percussionists, and we kind of understand what it takes to be able to play and be able to use these instruments effectively and produce the proper sounds and what kind of techniques are used on them, things like that.
Yeah.
So are there other performance scenarios that you think the multi-bass would be useful for musicians?
I mean, I kind of use it in pretty much every application that I'm doing. I know we've used them with the Tucson Symphony, like when we do a lot of the movie, like playing along to movie. I mean, we're not really using it in traditional orchestral classical stuff, but like when we need to set up a bunch of drums for like Star Wars or Harry Potter, those types of things are getting used in those types of applications. Yeah, I mean, I think they're using it a lot. I mean, even the latest pieces that I recorded, this piece Black Coyote that I commissioned from Russell Hardenberger, I think I used 2 multi-drums in the piece, and Russ was just like, that's the sound. I mean, like, that's it. I don't know. I mean, I kind of look forward to seeing, where these things are getting used. I'm just glad that people seem to like this drum.
Yeah, obviously, solo percussionist, chamber type stuff. They hear you mention movie music. It made me immediately think of MB Gordy, who's another one of our artists who plays out in California, but on a ton of TV and like movie scores and recordings and stuff. Kind of goes back to our sound conversation. Like he needed a sound that was a little more specific, not quite a tom, not quite a bass drum.
The purpose or the usefulness of these drums, I think, fit into a number of criteria. There's the sound criteria. There's the practicality criteria. There's the moving things around criteria. There's the, you know what I mean? Like all of those things factor into why I think the drum is as successful as it is because it checks a number of boxes that are required. Like I don't want to be moving 36-inch concert bass drums around when I play Ray Bond. I mean, like someone else might want to, but I'm over it, I'm over it, I'm over it.
Those days
are gone. Yeah, those days are long gone.
I do know an application that I never really thought of specifically for the multi-bass was I was working with a retailer who had a band director customer that was looking for a bass drum that a handicapped student could use and still participate with the ensemble. So I think it was used more like indoors, band and orchestra setting. They weren't able to reach a normal concert bass drum. So they wanted a drum that could be lowered to the size where it could be played in a wheelchair. So I was like, yes, because I'd never really thought of it in that context either. So I thought that was really pretty special.
Right, and that speaks to the practicality of, the usefulness and of the practicality of it.
I mean, is your performance specifically been enhanced by the instrument itself?
One of the things I definitely noticed early on when I started using the drum is I felt I had more fluidity playing around a setup. I've always felt like technique is obviously a big an important part of playing, especially multi-percussion pieces, and having played really large setup pieces like Z-Clues, where the setups all around you, and every size in between of that. I kind of like how I felt more serpentine when I was playing multi-percussion pieces, when I had multi-drums in the setup, where again, when the sizes went incrementally made sense. It just made everything just feel more fluid when I was playing. And this is much more, horizontal playing, more so than vertical playing, which is something I talk a lot about with technique, with playing even keyboard instruments or playing anything on percussion. Is more the idea of horizontal playing rather than like this constant, and having all these weird idiosyncrasies in your setup. It sort of eliminated that problem, and it sort of enhanced my ability to sort of be more at one with the setup itself.
So horizontal versus vertical playing, is there a little more you can share on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back, frankly, to, when we talk about the three things that I really love to do. I think that sort of idea, translates, or not translates, but is more in tune with ragtime xylophone, and even early George Hamilton Green, his early method books, he talks about that. But certainly working with Bob Becker for the number of years I have, it was always about like keeping your hammers, your mallets low to the keyboard and using kind of more wrist. Historically, a lot of the vaudeville players, like kind of the pre-era, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was kind of a showy type of playing. And the xylophone was kind of a hokey instrument anyways, considered at that time. So they're trying to get a laugh out of the audience, wink, wink, and it was really Green that said, no, this is a serious instrument. We got to really take the technique and how we approach playing this instrument more seriously. And he sort of developed that low profile playing. And certainly that's, if you watch someone like Bob Becker play any mallet instrument, not just xylophone ragtime, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's just so efficient, right? Like there's no wasted energy. And so that's the other part of it, right? The more you sort of play like this, there's a lot of energy being wasted as opposed to playing across. And so I think I know that's where it started with my playing, and then it just translated to my multi-percussion playing in all aspects of my percussion playing. But certainly, like if you think of a multi-percussion setup, it's kind of roughly the same size of trying to manage a 4-octave xylophone when you're playing ragtime. Like you're kind of at the far ends of the reach of what you're doing. And so the technique of pivoting at the hips, not trying to step up and down when you're playing, it really translates to the ragtime xylophone that I do to a multi-percussion setup. So it's not just the hands, it's the whole physical approach to that instrument. But that low profile horizontal playing, I think, really originated with just practicing so much on xylophone.
It's really smart, Morris. You should teach. You should at the university level, really higher education.
I'm trying. I don't know.
Personal reflection, Morris. Did you learn anything from this project that you might take into future collaborations or other instrument designs?
Yeah, I think, I don't feel like I overthought, I have to figure this thing out. I have to create this contribution to our art form. It's like, it really was born out of necessity. It really wasn't anything more than just paying attention to the inherent problems that were in front of me, and just thinking about solutions that were there. Like I wasn't trying to create problems to then create solutions. You know what I mean? It was like they were already there. So I think it has to be kind of a natural progression. It was like the years of playing, the years of trying to manage this problem. Finally, something just clicked, and it was just like, okay, enough. It was organic. If anything ever like that happens again in my life, where an idea comes up, I think it's just going to come from that place. I don't think it's going to come from me overthinking it, right?
And it's worth noting, obviously, that's why we're having this conversation, because it was innovative. Our collaboration and the drum was really the first of its kind. We've even taken the concept and moved from, okay, well, not everybody's able to purchase a bass drum, but the collaboration on the telescoping legs and that whole concept is like, okay, now we can modify this to fit an existing bass drum that somebody might have and help provide a solution. Have you heard any feedback or reception from from educators or players about it or things like that, or
Well, I
know of people that have them?
I think people buy these drums because they know they're really great drums, and so I think the feedback
sure.
in and of itself. But I have to say, and this is the truth, like the majority of schools that I go to and visit have these Black Swamp multi-bass drums. Like I do a festival every year in San Diego, SDSU.
Right.
They've got a bunch of the drums there, right? So I don't have to bring mine anymore. But yeah, I mean, I think that they're just kind of everywhere now.
Do you see the role of musicians, especially percussionists, kind of evolving in the design of new instruments, either collaborating with manufacturers or collaborating with composers?
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. Like, it's important that happens, I think, because who better to contribute than the people that are on the ground kind of using these things, and hopefully they'll be the ones that find the problems that need the solutions to, like we talked about earlier. It's important though that you have companies that have the resources or the ability not just to listen but to be able to actually act on it, like if they think it's a good idea to be able to go in that direction. I think early on, going back to the John Cage days, I mean, he was the guy that was kind of providing these solutions in many ways, or at least writing pieces that you could use whatever you could find, or if you need, just use regular pieces of wood for amores, or, whatever these pieces are that you need, these things. But I think as percussionists, I mean, just the level of ability of percussionists now, like at the undergraduate level, it's like shocking from when I was an undergraduate to what they're doing now. I mean, it's unbelievable. And so I do think that generally speaking, percussionists are in a better situation to be able to manage these things. Having the ability to have people listen to you, to be able to get these things made, I think is also equally important.
Have you ever kind of collaborated with a composer? Like, do you kind of collaborate with composers on sounds and instruments and things like that? Or
all the time. Every time I get to work with a living composer, I co-direct a festival in San Diego, Sound On Festival of Modern Music every year, and we bring out composers, we're playing their pieces. We're constantly, as the percussionist, I'm the only percussionist in the group. It's kind of like a Piero Lunaire type of instrumentation in the band. Yeah. It's kind of the most exciting part of the gig. I mean, I think that's what makes percussion so interesting,
When you mentioned like, the amount of options, or like as a percussionist is really interesting. Like, it can also be overwhelming, like sometimes. Right. And maybe not for the percussionist, maybe it's more for the composer or for the band director, because I'll have a lot of conversations I have are with band directors, and they'll be like, why do you have 8 different triangle beaters? It's like, don't you just need one?
Right.
It's like,
yeah, sure.
It's overwhelming,
right.
So it's an educational moment for me. It's like, well, okay, yeah, you can just have one, and if you want just one, buy this one, for this reason. But this is why we have these others, different colors, different sounds, different dynamics, things like that.
Right.
So
in many ways, I always thought about it as like, if you're into wine, there's like sommelier level appreciation of wine, and then there's like basic level. And I think the more you work on something, the more you're playing things, the more you're like, if you're an orchestral percussionist playing this repertoire, these pieces that need all these symbols, you start to refine your ear, your taste, what you want, and then the search begins, as opposed to just setting up 7 symbols that maybe a high school person would already be overwhelmed just finding those instruments. And yet, you might have hundreds of symbols that you use at the high level, sommelier level of percussionists, where you really can hear and appreciate that difference for you. And maybe people out there may not as much, but like, you need to do it for you, right? And I think that's what's important about it, right? So I think that's why having all these options is important. It may not be as important, but hopefully it gets to become more important the more skilled, the more educated, the more experienced you become as a musician, that you can appreciate this type of horsehair on your bow versus this, you know what I mean? Like, but it's real. It really is real. That I may not be able to understand those differences, but I'm pretty sure Yo-Yo Ma does, right? When he's playing. Sure. And I think that's what keeps it interesting, is that you get more into it. You just nerd out more about these things.
Interlochen Arts Camp is about 2 hours north of us here in Michigan. And I get up there a couple times a year, and Keith Aleo teaches up there.
Fantastic.
And these are, freshmen, sophomore, high school students, or seniors or whatever, already thinking about like, what is my sound? What do I want to hear? What type of instruments am I going to need for this piece? Well, what's maybe my music director or conductor going to want to hear? Kids so into the sound of a triangle and different sizes of triangles. Should I get this size or this size? Different triangle beaters. Like, they were so into it.
The reality is that, though, is providing those students the opportunity to hear all of those side by side by side by side by side. If you just brought one triangle, that's the option, right? If you brought two, but if you brought 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, 15, then that's what starts to develop, I think, a musician's ear. And also, I also feel very strongly that your sound as any musician is part of your identity as that musician, right? And so you start to hone in on the sounds you like, and that almost becomes definitive of who you are out there in the world when you walk on stage and play a sound. It's like, I picked that sound over other options for a reason, and so that defines where you are. And that's a tough thing to teach, actually, when, we have this giant cymbal vault at the University of Arizona, and, we've got all these different bands and stuff, and sometimes it's just like, grab a cymbal and put it on the stand, as opposed to like, do you even know what all these cymbals sound like? So that when it gets to that time, you hear it and you go, that's the one that I want for this particular, instance. And that's, again, trying to develop a sound palette that you like as a musician,
So what's the Morris Palter sound palette?
I know what I like. I can tell you that much. I mean, I don't know.
And know what you don't like.
Well, the reality is, I think a lot of sounds could fit in a lot of different, it's situational, right? It even situational, not just to the piece, but to the environment you're playing it in, the hall, you hear, where are you? It just takes time.
Do you think there's a limitation to developing your sound from technique? I mean, you can start thinking about your sound, but really, as far as crash cymbals go, you have to know how to play a good crash cymbal consistently before you can be like, oh, I like this sound.
Right. I mean, that's
like
part of that's whole part of the journey, right?
I appreciate your time, Morris.
Yeah.
I mean, awesome conversation. I have an opportunity to talk to artists and some of our educators, mostly at conventions and things like that. And part of what I love is I always learn something new just from being able to have these conversations, and something new about the player or concept or idea, things like that. So yeah, I appreciate that. And obviously thank you for the collaboration and sort of design and influence for the multibase. Like,
no problem. I really appreciate it. I can't wait to talk to you about my idea for a 70-inch temple block when I see you.
I was gonna ask if you had anything else in the works, but I did. Yeah,
I had a vision
like
of
a
temple
Pandora's
block
box,
taking up an entire room.